Rabia, just give me the go when we're ready to start.
Shall we?
Yes.
Are we ready? I'm waiting for the go, Rabia. Okay, I'm waiting for the go from you.
Go, go.
Go.
If Rabia me, it's okay.
Rabia Banna, you're okay? Can I go ahead?
Yes. تفضل.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We are extremely excited and honored to be launching this report and panel today. The report titled Justice to Transcend Conflict in Syria is part of a series of reports that provide multidimensional analysis of impact of the armed conflict in Syria between 2011 and 2019, examining the country's socioeconomic situation and institutional performance. This report diagnoses the conflict based on a human status framework that assesses the interlinkages between institutional, social, and economic factors on macro, meso, and local levels. The report also frames the conflict through a social justice lens and provides alternatives based on expert-developed participatory approaches. The authors today will present the main findings of the report, and then we will have an open discussion where the participants will be able to ask questions and share comments. The discussion will be moderated by myself. My name is Bassam Haddad. I teach at George Mason University and run the program for Middle East and Islamic Studies. I also am the executive director of ASI and co-editor of Jadaliyya, which is co-sponsoring this event. And we are extremely pleased to have with us Ramya Ismail, whose bio you could actually find on the invitation that was sent out. I will spare reading all the bios because they're pretty extensive. Omar Dahi and Rabi' Nasr. I will ask everyone to try to, as much as possible, to make their questions succinct. And I would ask you to type them to myself. I will send a message right now to everyone asking you to send me the message, not to everyone. So I can collate them and group the ones that are similar and ask our participants to address them in bulk form rather than fetch them throughout the lists and have repeat questions, which will actually take up more time than it needs to. I will be asking our participants, starting with Rabi' Nasr, to take 15 minutes to address the broader findings of the report. And then we'll ask Ramya and Omar to address the economic dimension and institutional dimension respectively in about 10 to 15 minutes. And then Rabi' Nasr will close with a discussion of the Bada'il project, the alternatives project. And before we proceed, let me share that we will also be tweeting this launch, and I will provide in the chat box the hashtags that everyone will be using, so feel free to use them, as well as feel free to send questions through Facebook. I understand that Rabia Banna is going to forward me the questions from Facebook. Before we start, let me just say that I have been working as an individual and as a member of an institution, which is the Arab Studies Institute and Jadaliyya, with the SCPR for several years, and I have seen them produce the material that actually is considered one of the most legitimate sources of data that is somewhat comprehensive, addressing all aspects of the Syrian conflict in all or virtually all zones and territories in Syria. And I am very proud to be connected with this project and feel that we are now witnessing what might very well be one of the most comprehensive treatment of the Syrian uprising and war. And very happy to be here. With that, I will yield to Rabia to start his presentation, and I will try to notify you when you might have a couple minutes to wrap up so we can keep track of time. Is there anything that our fantastic panel would like to address right before we start? Any logistical information? Okay, then welcome Rabia, welcome Omar, welcome Samia, and thanks Rabia Benna for organizing all the logistics, and we may start.
Thank you very much, Bassam. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for participation in this release of the report. We are proud of this cooperation with Jadaliyya and ASI, and I hope all of these open more platforms for dialogue, for constructive alternatives for the future, and for more role of the society in deciding how to counter the conflict in Syria. We are in the SCPR working on the socioeconomic impact and dynamics of the conflict since 2011, and we are trying to do evidence-based research as much as we can to bring more evidence to the public and to the quote-unquote policymakers around the world, since it's a more global conflict now. This report, I just want to say that is an effort of many of researchers, field workers, editors, and administration staff, and I just want to thank all of them for the incredible efforts that they spent to reach this point. The second thing that I want to say that it's a very painful report. We try as much as we can to be evidence-based and to be concentrate on the indicators, but it is Syria after almost a decade of pain and suffer. However, the main message of the report that we are looking for the future, and the future should be built on sustainable foundations. It should be built on gradual and rooted basis for the future, and that's why we are concentrated on the justice, to have a sustainable peace, a sustainable pathway to counter the conflict, and not to cover it or not to close the chapter with another conflict in the future. Having said that, I want to say that this report is implemented in the time of conflict. That's why there is a lot of new approach and methodologies that we tried, we adapted, and then there is a lot of constraints. So we tried our best to use different sources, primary and secondary sources, to try to verify our indicators' conclusions. But I have to say that there is a lot of constraints to do so. So we are open to a radical change and discussion in any of the chapters and indicators. And this is why we want to open the discussion to clarify, to correct, and to adjust in the future. It's a reflection of different reports, and we concentrate on justice. However, the report is covering the development from wide perspective, political, economic, and social sides. Why we are doing that? Because we want to set the narrative from all angles for Syria. And that's unfortunately countering a lot of narratives that reduce the narrative in Syria to a minor or a one-sided view about the conflict. Since I don't have a lot of time, I just invite you to visit the report, to take a look on any of the sections. We have introduction, social injustice, economic injustice, institutional injustice, and the last chapter is about justice to transcend conflict, which is a participatory approach to find some solutions. The key issue in this work that there is a lot of participatory approach, either in discussing the situation on the ground or discussing the options for the future, and that's we did with different experts, activists from Syria and from outside Syria. The report is for the whole of Syria, so we are covering all regions. And since we have a lot of aspects that we are dealing with in this report, we didn't report all the details regarding the governorates or the municipalities. We just highlight some key issues there, but we have our base in our analysis is the working on the local level and then building up to the national level. We choose the concept of justice as it's as a core cause of the conflict and as a main value to build on for a solution for the future. I will not go through the literature. There is a chapter on the literature, but we have an intensive discussion about what we mean by justice and why we choose this definition. We have a specific definition of the justice as an equitable rights and entitlements of citizens that assure fair social political rights for all, and in terms of capabilities, opportunities, and outcomes as perceived by society. And this is the key word, that we are mixing between different schools that are dealing with justice from moral point of view and from, I will say, practical point of view, especially Amartya Sen, who is talking about the reducing the constraints from the society point of view that reduce the injustice is the key point or practical point, rather than just building a dream or ideal picture of the future society. Based on the justice concept, this is the spirit of the report that we are dealing with. It is beyond inequalities, it's beyond fairness, because we are talking about substantial collapse of different foundations of the society. We have the narrative about the injustice as a core root of the conflict, and in the SCPR we are dealing with different I would say aspects of the analysis. First, the institutional suffocation as a major issue in Syria before the conflict, which is, we said that this is the top root of the conflict. We mean by institutional suffocation the political oppression, which make a huge diversion between the society and the institutions that control, the formal and informal institutions, which increased, expanded across time and make any kind of mitigation or compromises not accessible or not achievable. The second issue is about the social exclusion. All the social networks and initiatives and relations is under a control of what we call it the institutional, that using the security strategy mainly. And we have another layer, which is the dominance of traditional social actors as well. The neoliberal policies, economic inequalities, crony capitalism, is a mainstream policies that encouraged by different international actors and created a huge damage to the economy and the welfare and to the equality across the country. And we addressed this briefly in this report and more intensive way in previous reports. And finally, the external hegemony, that we are talking about a country that is marginalized, a country that suffer from military occupation of Julan and the Palestine, different interventions in terms of military interventions, and exclusion in terms of the economic relations as well. The collapse of Iraq and invasion by the American to Iraq, all of these external factors is accumulated the exclusion of the country and encourage more the oppressive authoritarian regimes to be in power. The life cycle, we have injustice that lead to the conflict or substantially lead to the conflict. However, during the conflict, we have new dynamics that increased, aggravate injustice. It's created a lot of grievances and upgraded to the new levels, which is sustained the conflict and most probably created the conflict in the future if we don't deal with it. So this is how we understand the dynamics. It's not the same injustice. It's not the same conflict. Every phase we have a new conflict foundations and we have a new aspects of the injustice. There is many issues we called it, new in this report. One of them is dealing with injustice in three aspects. The first one is retroactive injustice. That means all the damage that happened now that cause injustice for the history, for the effort of the people in the history. So all the damage for tangible or intangible accumulation of wealth and culture and social capital that we have now, it is the accumulation of work of generations. So the damage that we have for this accumulation now is a damage for and injustice that we are sending for the history. So this is one aspect. The second aspect is the injustice now, which is the injustice on the activities and culture and productivity actions now in the current time. And injustice for the future, it's designing the institutions to produce another injustice in the future. So we are dealing with three different elements and that complement each other in terms of injustice. We have a huge injustices in terms of socioeconomic and political sides, but this injustice is uneven. It is not the same across the Syrian people and geographical areas. We are dealing with this from class, gender, age, political affiliation, culture, background aspects. So it's not from one aspect. That's why this is multidimensional report. We can read it from different angles. The main approach that we use to have a comprehensive understanding of Syria and the conflict is we call it the human status framework. A human status framework is including of 5 main elements, including the inclusive economy, demographic transition, the participatory and just institutions, the human empowerment or human development, and the social solidarity and human security. So we have these 5 elements. We tried to have a huge survey in 2014, and we succeeded in this with more than 2,000 key informants. And it's updated in 2019, and we built an indicator from this quantitative and qualitative data. So this is on the right-hand side. I'm sorry, this is just confusing one, but it's the main index with 5 elements, main pillars, and with almost 50 sub-indicators. And that's why we try to measure all the aspects of the conflict in this framework. Some key aspects of this indicators that we can see the collapse after 2011. This is the 2014, and then we have here the projection and then update. And we can see that there is a slight improvement in the 2017 to 2019. And this is a very important message that there is a reduction in the military interventions, but this is not reflecting in overcoming the conflict. And it's not reflecting in mitigating the foundation of the conflict. And we will explain this in a bit. So we have better demographic index, a slight better demographic index between 2014 2019. However, this is because of the reduction of the number of deaths and percentage of death. In the economic side, we have a slight improvement as well. In the Human Development Index, we have a slight drop. And the same in the social capital, and a huge drop in the institutional index. So the behavior, the functions of the key institutions, although we have a reduction or mitigation in the terms of the direct military interventions, they didn't prevent the deterioration of the institutions or the abuse of institutions. We can see that there is a reduction in different indicators. This is the economic indicators, but here there is an improvement of living conditions as there is more accessibility to areas and there is less sieged areas. However, we still have a huge damage to the infrastructure. As you know, in the last 3 years, we have a huge battle that happened in Idlib, Raqqa, Dar'a, Ghouta, to name a few. I just want to highlight some of those key issues. Like education, for example, we have continuation of deterioration, especially in the quality of education. We still have more than a third of the children out of the school before Corona, of course. I will conclude this key results with the institutional aspects. As you can see, the inner cycle is the 2019. It is the worst in performance except for the prevalence of violence. So this is better than 2014. However, all other indicators in terms of corruption, equality, efficiency, rule of law, and accountability is worse. So we have a continuation of collapse of the institution, or I will say conflict-centered institutions that's controlling the lives of the people. And we can divide this into 4 areas, but across time it differs. But we have the most brutal phase of the conflict by the behavior of the state against the society and the behavior of ISIS against the society. So we have a very extreme cases that we witness in Syria, and the impact and externalities goes beyond. I will briefly go through the section of social impact of the conflict, and I will concentrate on the social degradation. In this section, we cover different issues from the human development point of view, like health, poverty, education, demographic side, and we deal with social relations, gender issues, and children as well. But I will have this link or this line of analysis that related to the degradation. So we are talking in the social side on squandering of lives, entitlement, capabilities, and relations. And this have been conducted systematically during the last 9+ years. The major tool or mean for war that it's scary for all of us for now and for the people inside and outside Syria is the industrialization of identity politics, using the ethnicity, regions, classes, nationalities, displacement status as an identity to fuel the conflict. And it is very, very important tool for conflict, because it's easy to kill when you have one identity, or you believe that you are a threat from the other identities. So using this as a tool was, I mean, across all the 9 years is a very damaged for the values, norms, and for the respect of the human being and the right of life. And we think this is underestimated in terms of research, in terms of building the coalition to constrain the using of identity politics. Now we have a new social structure. We have the biggest reshift, forced reallocation of wealth, of everything in Syria. It's not about just the damage, it's the reallocation of wealth, is restructuring of classes, of norms, of relations. And the last point that we think is the worst impact of the conflict is the pessimistic spirit. The people subordinated, or it seems that most of them don't have a hope for the future, and part of the people adapt by identified to the oppressor. So we became alienated to the oppressor, and we think this is a huge social problem. Without going through the details, we are talking about a continuation of the collapse of the social capital, and especially the social network. And this is the most important side, which is the structural social capital that link the people across identities, regions, etc. Gender injustice, that we can see that most of the killed and participated in the conflict directly are men, and most of the injuries, kidnapped, are from the male side. And unfortunately, the conflict created a new structure that excludes women. This is victory. So that exclude women more, because of the conflict increase the domination of the people who are participating directly in the conflict. And the second side, that using the abuse of women and exclude of women and sexual based violence as a tool of war. And we have a lot of evidence and a lot of documentation. And this is just one very important side of Syria conflict, that we have substantial documentation in videos and document in research, but this is not reflected in any reaction or any action that can be in the conflict. The social status deterioration, the constraint of mobility, the woman has and the girls have had a huge burden, and still, and maybe the future will be, there is more burden for as a reflection of what happened during the conflict. The child violations, we can name, Syria is the worst of the worst country in terms of the children security and children protection. And this is a report by Save the Children in 2018. And we have all that we see as extreme grave violations, including targeting children, killing children, injuries, and of course the disability, arresting, recruitment, and lately reaching to the point that they are recruited in the conflict economy activities. A distortion of displacement and refugees. There is 2 chapters on the determinants of displacement and on the relation and the status of the refugees, especially the lack of participation and lack of access to decent work or building capabilities and invest in capabilities. Syria now is the rank of Syria in terms of HDI based on our calculations is 180 out of 189. So we are one of the worst 10 countries in terms of the human development, and this is by itself is an indicator that that reflects the huge burden that we have. life expectancy, we have a huge drop until 2014 and 15, and then we have a slight increase because of reduction of the death. But this burden will continue because this affects a specific category of the people, and we have more that the burden of injuries, which will be reflected on more death in the future. In terms of education, we lost 25 million years of education for the basic education and more than 43 million for the whole education system. So recovery is something like it's not imaginable. And the problem that we still have it, we still have a lot of dropout of Syrians inside and outside the country. The same, you can see here the drop in the investment in fixed and constant price of the public expenditure on education. We have 6 curricula across the country, and you can see that we have different population with different children, different generations. Poverty is 86%. Of course, this is end of 2019. Now the situation is worse, but at least you can see that we are a country of poor people and war elite. The same for food security. We have a deterioration in many aspects, especially the stability for the food security, and this is a major issue. And the agriculture, the good agriculture sector in Syria saved us, but all the other factors lead the Syrians to food insecurity. I will leave now to the economic section, and sorry if I take more time.
Thank you, Rabia. We will transition to our next participant, Ramya Ismail. Ramya Ismail, we are very glad and honored to have you join us. You will be addressing the economic dimensions, and you have about 10 to 15 minutes. Please proceed.
Hello, everybody. So we will continue now with the economic parts of our report. So conflict economies dynamics actually function systematically supported by external and internal factors. On one hand, governmental or policies and institutions of governmental and non-state actors work to reallocate economic and human resources to support and sustain conflict. On the other hand, external, direct and indirect intervention work to flame the war and to hinder any kind of settlement or conflict resolutions. So, sorry. Tactics and strategies of conflict economy concentrated on destruction and fragmentations. So different conflict-related activities, destruction of public and private assets and infrastructure, cities and areas, looting of wealth, displacement and reconstruction, all of them worked as tactics and strategies of conflict economy. As a result, 86% of people fell in poverty, while crony capitalists and warlords accumulate wealth and capture the power. So, although that the economy actually witnessed 7.9% in economic growth driven by agriculture and manufacture sectors, however, the total economic losses until 2019 was 530 billion US dollar, which equal 10 times of 2010 GDP. And during this period, the economy contracted 2/3 comparing to 2019. And here we can see how the accumulated losses in GDP from 2010 to 2019. Losses in infrastructure and capital stock was major. So it reached 64.6 billion until 2019. And 67% of this, the capital stock damaged was an opportunity and idle loss, and 33% was a direct damage. On the sectoral level, the main losers were the internal trade and the governmental services. The internal trade lose about 20% of the total GDP losses, which account about 421 billion US dollar. And the governmental service account 90% of these losses. Speaking about losses, we can also mention, or deserve to mention, that agriculture and manufacture sectors achieve a positive growth due to the improvement in the rainfalls and the decrease in the military activities, where the contribution of the agriculture account about 30% and the manufacture about 90% of the GDP. The main feature of the conflict economies was the reallocation of human capital and wealth from productive expenditure to who's moving. So the reallocation was, as we said, so the allocation of wealth and the human capital from productive and expenditure to the military expenditure, using different policies like ad hoc realities, monopoly, smuggling, human and different trafficking, and also establishing different laws and legislations which constitute a kind of incentives to war elite to accumulate and reallocate wealth for their interests. And also there was a drop in the social protection from different sides, the decrease of the health and education expenditure, and also the decrease in the public subsidies. Here we can see that how the reallocation of the wealth direct to the military expenditure. The direct and official and unofficial military expenditure accounted 38 billion US dollar. This is the accumulation from 2009 to 2019. And in the fiscal policy, we can see that in general, the public expenditure was half of the expenditure in 2019, and also the revenues decreased from 25% of GDP to 7% in 2019. And as we mentioned, that the drop of the social production can be seen in the decrease in the public subsidies, as we see here in the right chart, from 20% GDP in 2011 to about 5% in 2019. And this affects not only the living conditions of the people who became more poor, but also increase the prices and affect the manufacturing sector by increasing the production of inputs. Here we can see how the price affected first from the exchange rate, who increased dramatically. The last wave of currency depreciation reached 43% in September 2019 compared to July 2018. And from the other side, we can see that the consumer price index increased about 18 times from June 2011 to 2019, and the inflation rate reached 33% in 2019. In the labor market, also we can see here, in the labor market, we can see that the labor market lost about 3.7 million job opportunities, and the total employment decreased from 5 million in 2011 to 3 million in 2019. The employment rate reached reached 42% in 2019 and decreased and it was about 15% in 2011. The main characteristics of the labor market that most experience gathered during this year was the conflict-related experience, and most incentives encouraged young people to involve more in the conflict economies rather than going to the productive sectors. Also, another feature of the conflict economy was the dependency and instability, which represented in different aspects. First, the depending on the aids and humanitarian funds, as we can see here from the left chart, that how much the humanitarian funds as percentage of GDP increased and was the peak in 2016 and reduced after that. Also, the increase in trade deficit and depending on imports to provide necessities from food and fuel is one of the dependency features of the conflict economies. Also, the trade partners was also the war partners, as we can see here, the imports partners, Turkey, Iran, and China and Russia was the first trade partners. From the export side, we can see Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Egypt. And also Turkey have the 5th position, has the 5th position. Also, we can see here that another feature is that total domestic and foreign debt, the accumulation from 2010-2019, the blue one was the domestic debt, also increased as a percentage of GDP and caused instability in the economy and the dependency. Finally, we can say that the conflict economy institutionalized in the way that it creates its own actors and make a foundation of laws and legislations, formal and informal institutions, de facto policies, which supported those actors and reallocate resources for their interests. What they call the reconstruction actually led to to empower the war elite and to capture the power in their hand. In the same time, people became more poor and grievances and injustice for them, it was a part of their normal life. And finally, the external actors became part of the political life, part of the decision makings, and also a part in the Syrian institutions. So if we want to speak about economic recovery or constitution, it will be impossible without dismantling conflict economies and establishing a new, just, effective and inclusive institutions. Thank you. بسام.
Thank you راميا. بتاخد اوقات هيك لحظه واحد يكبس الميوت انميوت بutton. شكرا. شكرا راميا. Thank you راميا Ismail very much for this presentation, and you were very much on time. The actual clock didn't interrupt us. We are moving right now to Omar Dahi, who will address the institutional dimension. I would like to remind everyone that you can start sending your question as Omar begins, as Rabia, after Omar begins to wrap up, to all of the panelists, because apparently you cannot send it directly to me. So please send it to all panelists only, so we could collate, combine the questions, and I will be addressing them to our panelists right after Rabia ends. Omar Dahi, we are again very excited and honored that you are joining us. Please, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
All right, thank you very much, Bassam, and hello everybody, and thank you for attending today. I'm going to go briefly over the section of the report that's about institutions. I think this is a very important section for the report. I think it's a very important contribution by the SCPR towards our understanding of the conflict in Syria. And I'm just going to briefly go over why this section is in the report and what are its implications before I, again, very briefly go over the main subsections in this chapter. As Rabia mentioned in the beginning, part of the innovative methodology that was involved in the report was not just including the SCPR in-house research, which was extensive, but the Development Policy Dialogue Forum series, which was, as Rabia mentioned, a series of workshops, two-day workshops that involved experts on Syria, whether they're Syrian or non-Syrian, in different aspects of the conflict. And it was a very intentional exercise that brought in people who have significant expertise on what's happening, though they may not have the time to write, they may not have the time or ability to express or share their expertise in other ways. And so this part, and the part that Rabia is going to present as well, but also other aspects of the report are outcomes of these dialogues to whom the report owes its thanks. In terms of the importance of this section, there were three main goals for including this institutions section. One was to try and connect the different threads together of, how do we understand the totality of the picture in Syria, and searching for some of the deeper causes for the outcomes that are presented elsewhere in the report, such as the economic destruction, the social degradation, all the other aspects that were mentioned by my colleagues. So that's the first section, first goal. The second goal was to keep a longer time frame, or to present some of these outcomes or some of these discussions, particularly with the lens of justice, within a longer time frame. To think about the fact that institutional injustice in Syria did not start in 2011. It existed before 2011. The conflict exacerbated this injustice in various ways and created new institutions and new actors, which themselves had different manifestations. And this struggle will continue after the armed conflict is over. And so thinking about the lens of justice as a way of transforming institutions is thinking beyond simply the names that can possibly change, or brokered agreements among the elite actors of the conflict. All of those things may open up the possibilities for positive change, however, they may not. And thinking about the institutional aspect, whether it's institutions and organizations under the areas of control by the government of Syria or those outside the control of the government of Syria, allows us to think in a uniform lens about various forms of institutional transformation. The third aspect of this section is the mapping of the actors involved in the conflict in Syria today, and the disaggregation of the foundations of power of each of those actors, as well as the priorities of each of those actors. So this includes internal actors such as the government of Syria, the autonomous administration areas, the opposition areas, and extremist groups, as well as external actors such as Russia, United States, Iran, Turkey. Looking at those different actors and looking at how do they pursue their priorities, how do they pursue their goals, what are the foundations of their power? Is it military? Is it their capacity to control natural resources? Is it their capacity to mobilize people? Is it societal acceptance? All of these were presented as different criteria for understanding the foundations of power of these different actors, as well as disaggregating what are their priorities. And here the report also included civil society, of course, as an actor in Syria right now. And the priorities included whether they prioritize stability, autonomy, peace, freedom, democratic deliberation. And the attempt here was to, as I said, there was desire to look at the long-term struggle, but in this particular disaggregation, there was a desire to look at the various ways in which these different actors pursue their goals, to possibly think about areas of convergence, similarities or differences, particularly in the areas of priorities between these different actors that may lead to thinking about emerging from the conflict. So if there are areas of convergence, how can that be a pathway towards pushing for positive change? So those are some of the main goals involved with this section. The subsection included, the first was this mapping of actors and how the struggle for power throughout the conflict essentially saw many of these actors, if not all of them, instrumentalize the different institutions under their control for the pursuit of the armed conflict, which was the struggle for power. The second section was the judiciary. So we can maybe perhaps move there. Let's see. Okay, we can go back to the title page. We can go back to the page, right? Let me go through these one by one, and we can stay here, and then we'll go to the other charts later. So there was the judicial section, and which is the looking at how the government of Syria either marginalized judicial institutions rather than seeing them as a means of arbitration or conflict management or conflict settlement. There was either instrumentalization of the judiciary for the pursuit of the conflict or a complete marginalization of the judicial sector. And this similar exercise is repeated or discussed in areas outside of the government of Syria control. The next subsection was that of civil society and its various roles, including the very positive role played early on by civil society, which was an attempt to push for institutional transformation along more just lines, along the lines of democratic deliberation, but how the foundations of power of civil society, which was societal cohesion, societal unity, became fragmented due to the polarization that happened as a result of the war. And as a result, a lot of groups were marginalized, moved outside the country, or increasingly became dependent on external support for their survival, which also influenced their ability to pursue their goals. The next part looks at the private sector, and here again, as with the other actors, the private sector is disaggregated into multiple different types of the private sector. This includes armed groups or military forces that themselves took advantage of their power, took advantage of their control of natural resources to pursue capital accumulation. This includes non-armed groups, private sector, but private capitalists, private sector individuals who are connected to armed groups and who benefited from their status as go-betweens or as those who were connected to their ability to supply armed groups with their needs or to take advantage of armed group control over resources. There's also the refugee private sector, that which moved outside the country. There's also the internal, what we call the resilient private sector, which is still inside the country, small, medium-sized enterprises, which have tried to adapt as much as possible to the evolving conflict. The next subsection looked at international organizations, including various humanitarian organizations, as well as United Nations institutions, and looking at the duality of their roles. On the one hand, these have been crucial for securing the needs of Syria's population, which, as you saw from the previous discussions, were vast. So they played an essential role in food security, in livelihood security, in health and education. At the same time, they suffered from various problems, including coordination problems, including their fragmentation, depending on the areas in which they operated. And for a large part, they were not immune from being under the control or being instrumentalized in some way by the armed groups or by the de facto powers under which they existed and they performed their roles. So there was a struggle by many of them to perform their roles in ways that separated them from the types of conflict economies that Ramia was discussing. The next section talks about the larger or bigger circles of injustice going up to the UN Security Council and the inability of international law institutions to function in Syria, to find a way to incorporate international law or to implement international law in the country. This reflects, in a way, the global power struggles which have manifested themselves on Syrian territory. So as Ramia mentioned, there was an external dimension, obviously, to the conflict, as we all know, and the injustice taking place in Syria was, in a sense, a reflection of these broader trends and broader struggles globally and within the Security Council. The last subsection in this chapter looks at sanctions. There was not an extensive examination of the impact of sanctions in the report. This is something that's happening and will come later by the center. However, there were three main aspects that this section drew attention to. The first is separating sanctions against individuals or entities that were responsible for human rights violations, which the report saw as necessary for the prosecution of justice. The second aspect was broad-based sanctions on different oil, manufacturing, trade sectors, which through various channels had a negative impact on the population and may have exacerbated the war economy. And finally, looking at the implementers of these sanctions, as for this process to actually work and for it to achieve its goals, it has to have a transparency, and it has to have those implementers or those forcing the sanctions or prosecuting the sanctions be themselves not involved in the conflict itself. And that's the case in the case of Syria, that many of those groups were involved in fueling the conflict itself. So these were three broad titles within the sanctions section to draw attention to issues that need to be discussed, and that's something that is going to happen through subsequent initiatives by the SCPR and through the Development Policy Dialogue Forum, perhaps. So this was just a brief overview of the institution's impact, and I'll hand it back to Rabia to conclude the report.
Thank you, Omar, for this insightful intervention. As you said, we will proceed to ask Rabia to address the Bada'il project, the alternatives project, on which we have at ASI collaborated with SCPR for some years now, and I hope that we continue to provide you with information about where this project is headed. Rabia, you have about 5 to 7 minutes before we actually open this up to questions. I would like to ask our attendees have questions to begin sending them to the panelists only, and I will try to call as much as possible, and we should be able to entertain at least 30 to 45 minutes of questions, pending the energy of our panelists. Shukran. Proceed, Rabia. Shukran.
Shukran, Bassam, Omar, Ramia. Thank you very much, everyone. I will try to be very much brief, but I think there is usually this concentration on the last part, which is the alternatives. And this time we spent most of our time on this part to create some strategies or initiatives that could be feasible and could be fulfilling what we want in the future in terms of solidarity, freedom, justice. However, not just a normative conclusion or normative recommendations. And in this regard, I will try to just brief 4 examples that we are suggesting as a core strategies that could be very important to work on toward justice, toward countering the conflict, even without a peace settlement. So it depends, of course, on different factors, but I will explain this in brief. And this is part of the wide discussion with the development policy dialogue that we have with more than 100 Syrian experts. So first, as a key conclusion, and this is just, I'm reflecting on one question that Fuad posted for all, that yes, it's not equal. This is not equal, but it depends on how to measure the factors that affect conflict. We said that through this report that we have 5 key factors or lessons learned that we have to learn before we move forward. That political tyranny cannot build a development. And if this tyranny built a development for 40 or 50 years, it could destroy everything and more. So the idea that there is a good political tyranny or good pro-growth authoritarian regime, we are an example of the failure of this. The idea of identity politics is very dangerous, and it's like building and investing in the hatred across the people, fragmentation across societies, and this is another aspect that it's aggravated to reach the peak in Syria, and this is another thing that if we don't deal it with, this will create more conflicts in the future. The conflict economies and the neoliberal policies that's now have been repeating again and again, and these two parts, the conflict economy and neoliberal policies, why they have this kind of harmony? Because they don't mind huge inequalities. Unfortunately, all the neoliberal policies that implemented before the Arab Spring shifted the wealth toward crony capitalists, toward new elite that controlling the lives of the people. So just to highlight that this is one of the main conclusions of the report. The global injustice is not shouldn't be oversighted, and this is not something that need to be reflected or discussed just on the local level. We have now the pandemic that create a lot of narratives. I hope that this will not be reduced or dismissed in the near future if someone discover a vaccine or something like that. And finally, the suffer of the Syrian people, the injustice, the grievance. This is a very important factor that could fulfill and fuel the conflict for generations. For that, we have 4 suggestions, as I mentioned. The first one, the social congruences. It's not about consensus. It's not about agreement. It's building gradual, multidimensional, on different level of priorities between different actors. So instead of waiting for external actor to find out the consensus, which is not a consensus, it's imposed written agreement, instead of discussing, and this is very important part of this strategy, instead of discussing the text of the constitution, which is very important, but there is a huge polarization and injustice and grievances on the ground between the actors, between the people, between the communities. So this approach suggests that building congruences, gradual one. If the second priorities of one actor reach the 7th priority of the other, this could be a starting point to build for the future. And we have the multi-equilibrium. Multi-equilibrium means that we reach a specific non-stable equilibrium, and then we start to build to reach the other point. And this need, and I can give a very clear example about that, which is the coronavirus, which is something that could be agreed if we open the discussion among actors or among social communities or among people, individuals inside, outside the country, to reach the point of agreeing on one core issue. Refusing the conflict economy is something that many of the segments of the society, even the polarized one, are agreed about. So building this kind of bridge for a specific, not the whole issues, is very important to start the point that first the Syrian society come together on common points or common priorities, and then to start to gradually build for the future, because imposing agreement will not build the future, unfortunately. This is, of course, if you agree with one actor, you would disagree with others on different things, but you agree with a specific value or a priority, and this is very important for building the solution for the future. And this could be between the internal actors and the external actors. And this is not just a dream or just looking for an ideal solution. This is an exercise that we did with the experts in the dialogue. And the zero is the civil society. So we measure the distance between civil society in terms of priorities and other actors. Here, the internal actors. So this is the regime, for example. And here, the yellow one is the self-administration. The blue one is HTS. So these priorities, justice, freedom, solidarity, sustainability. So we have this kind of discussion. What's the priorities of the regime? What's the priorities of the civil society? And we measure the distance between them. So the more the actor is far away from the zero, is the more there is a distance between this actor and civil society. So in terms of justice, the farthest actor from civil society is the regime. Now, the size of the ball is the power of the actor, the weighted power, because we have another discussion about the weight from different aspects as well. But this is another research that reflect the weight. So it's not just looking for different actors. It's also important to see the weight. Now, putting the priorities of this 14th priority, you can see that there is some areas that it's not a top priority for different actors, but it is close to each other. So for example, development, sustainability, peace, social acceptance. So we have some areas. Of course, this is an exercise, so we can do it for thousands, hundreds of thousands of Syrians to reach the point that we are starting from substantial point, but it's not our top priority. So the top priority for civil society is freedom, is democracy, is justice. We could start from development or sustainability with one condition, that we are looking for solidarity, freedom, justice on the long term. Now the same for the external actors. So we are not discussing between each other as Syrians, and we can reach an agreement. This is the first. Okay. So this is an example of the priorities of different actors, and also we can see where is the weight and the closest point to the civil society. So we can see, for example, that UN is the closest in terms of priorities to the civil society. EU is the next one, and at the end we can find Israel and Turkey and Iran, etc. Of course, this is not to give I mean the results of the research. This is to give the idea that we can start from congruences that could be reached by different actors. Dismantling conflict economy. What's the motivations? What's the rationale? Why the different actors will accept this second strategy? This is our fourth arguments. The first one, that there is a huge potential of further collapse. There is a failure of what's called reconstruction. Turkey now talking about reconstruction in the north, regime talking about reconstruction in the country. And in the last 3 years, after the reduction of military operations, they failed. So there is a huge potential of collapse of the whole economy. The second one is the depleting of resources. And this make the whole country is not attractive if it continue with the same scenario. The spillover of the conflict economy on in the region and other countries, which make it dangerous on the global level. The fatigue of support, as you can see that the humanitarian support from UN channel or outside it have been dropped, and we will drop more after Corona. So we have for each one of these 5 elements a lot of proposals in terms of how to deal with dismantling conflict economy and create alternatives for that. But this need a lot of work. For example, instead of working as giving loans for specific investors, to give the network that are anti-conflict economy more support. Now, the idea of solidarity economy is a very long story, and we have a lot of research on this, and we want to discuss it more. And we think that if we think about external loans to rebuild the country, this will be impossible. We need the human capital of Syria to come back and to contribute through institutions that respect and that bring them to contribute. And this needs a new type of the economy that we proposed, and solidarity economy of what is one aspect of that. Prioritizing social justice in each of the projects or initiatives. So any project that could be built, okay. Since I have 1 minute, I will just skip those, and I will invite you to read more about this and to discuss this. The nodes strategy is a strategy that concentrate on overlapping between nodes, we call it, or centers of development across the country. We don't need to build the huge projects, but we need to connect these nodes. So building a relation between Deir ez-Zor across river is as important as bringing products and living conditions. So building schools next to the farmers who are regulating their irrigation is as important as the production of food. So what we are trying to propose here is more reconnecting the country, overcoming of all the polarization that we have through development, social relations, solidarity, and economic activities. And there's a lot of details about that. This is very important part of starting without waiting to the end of the conflict to start building this kind of nodes that it's the starting seeds for future overlapping development. And finally, the children. I think this is another motivation for all of the actors. Or I will say when I'm saying actors, I mean there is a lot of social communities that will not refuse starting with children, that excluding children from the conflict economy, from the targeting, from building a new future. So maybe this is one of the starting point of how to recover with our children, recover with their education, learning skills, health, protecting them from the major violations that we talked about. And this could be a good starting point. Of course, Corona it seems that it's now a missed opportunity, but this is one of the issues that we can build on to build congruences, to build more real development, and not waiting to the Dayton deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia. Thanks, Sam, Ramya, and Omar. Also, thanks to the other Rabia for being in the background and controlling the logistics. Before we move to the questions, I would like to ask a couple of questions and kind of abuse my privilege as the moderator. But before we even do that, considering we have a bit of time, may I ask Omar and Ramya, as well as Rabia, to give us, if they are interested, to give us maybe a last minute or a final comment or something that you feel that you wanted to address before the set of questions. You can pass, but if you feel you have something to address as a conversation starter, please go ahead. Let's start with Ramya, if you have anything on your mind or...
As maybe it was the last sentence I mentioned, economic injustice, it was clear. No one can negotiate or discuss or argue about this. But the main thing is that without dismantling the economic conflicts, without establishing a just, inclusive institutions, speaking about reconstruction, speaking about economic recovery, maybe someone's look at the economic and indicators and see that the economic growth is 7.9, something positive, but it's not, because without dismantling conflict economy, it's so difficult to speak about economic recovery or any kind of reconstruction in a justice way. So that's the main message about the conflict economies and or the economic part.
Thank you. Omar?
All I would say is, I think a lot of people who are working and thinking, and so many people concerned about Syria, obviously primarily Syrians themselves, are thinking about, how do we think about where the conflict has brought us and moving forward. And I think one of the assets or the contributions of this report is that it attempts to move in a way that does not lose sight of the big picture issues and the root causes of the conflict, which it alludes to in this report, but also has worked on the SCPR, that is, on various other reports. It doesn't lose sight of the original societal demands that animated the social movement since 2011, demanding institutional change, demanding freedom, justice. But at the same time, looking at how can we think about practical ways to move out of the conflict. I think that combination is a real asset for the report, and those linkages are a real asset that is really worth exploring. So it's a very rich report in that sense, both in terms of the different social and economic sections, but also the node strategy that Rabia, for example, mentioned as ways of thinking about how to move forward. And I think that combination is very valuable.
Thank you, Omar. Rabia, would you like to make some comments as your last thoughts before we have the discussion?
Yes, just one comment that addressing the justice in this way that we propose is not reducing the importance of the judicial justice or the importance of the protecting and assuring the importance of implementing the justice against the criminals. This is part of what we're proposing. However, we said that it is not enough. So any kind of arrangements without changing the foundation of the conflict will not create a sustainable justice. What we are proposing here is shifting in the foundations. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we move to the few questions that we have, allow me to take this moment, first of all, to thank you all for a very insightful set of presentations and a unique window into a number of dimensions related to the Syrian conflict, many of which are not sufficiently addressed, not only in media, but also in academia and also in the region itself. So there is a virtual impossibility to refer to all of the important insights and conclusions and findings in this report, because it's very broad. And I know from the process, because I was somewhat close to it over the past few years, that so many things were also left out. Not everything was included, and I know that this could be expanded upon greatly. But we will try as much as possible to address some of these issues. And we, as we have discussed, we will be publishing the report on Tadween Publishing and make it open access to anyone who wishes to download it. This will happen quite soon. Before we get to that point, I would like to ask each of you to address one matter, and that is, based on the report that is before us, and based on what you know about the dominant discourse on the Syrian conflict, whether it's related to the political conflict, the economic situation, the institutional situation, the humanitarian situation, and so on, or even the discursive dimension. Can each of you tell us, in your own, based on your own observations, what is it about this report that provides a corrective to some of the supposedly accepted norms and knowledge and claims about the Syrian conflict? What is it about this report that provides a corrective, or provides a response, or debunks some of what we hear about in the public sphere, as well as in the journalistic and academic spheres, or on the streets even? Because this is a good way to understand the value of such reports that are based on fieldwork and ample data collected very meticulously over time. So if we could address some of these gaps between what the report provides and some of the dominant discourses, claims, and conventional wisdom out there. And I will, let's start chronologically with how we present it. So I'll start with Rabia.
Yes. I will say, I can't say that that there is something unique in the report, but at least I will say that there is many fanatic or polarized way of doing research around Syria, and this aggravate, expand one point of view, sometimes make some illusions about one point of view, so build the whole story of Syria, Alawite, Sunni, or Kurdish Arabic, which is something exists, but they expand the story and dream it as a core of the story. The other narrative is about either disregard the impact of sanctions or aggravate that the sanction is destroying the country. So I think in this report, we try to bring down everything to the evidence-based first. So we can see where is the dynamics, how the institutions affect, how it create policies and how it create dynamics without ignoring the economic side, the social side, the political side. So I think this is one of the thing that we bring together with some measurement, I would say, quote unquote. So this could be a very good ground to open the discussion on an objective way from one side and to create more space for the society. The second point is the role of society, because most of the Syrians that lost the hope and most of the actors and experts said that there is no substantial role of the society. And we think that there is a big role of the society. there is a big role that's threatening all the authoritarian and subjugating powers. And so we are reinvesting in this report in the role of society in the change for the future, as not because from just moral point of view, but from practical point of view. If the society with all of this anger continue, it will be a huge actor to destroy any kind of stability in the future. And the third point is looking for the future. And this is not just looking from a point of view of UN system or from the constraints of fund or the constraints of political approach. It's opening for more, I will say, creative discussion about finding solution, finding gradual solution, without being polarized to reduce the solution to what's available now. So if it's institutional constitution or committee, so it will be the only solution, because this is, otherwise you are ruining the solution. If there is Geneva, it should be Geneva. So we think that this report is invitation for all actors, first to compromise, second to bring people more to agree on point for the future.
Thank you, Rabia. Omar, or actually the next person in line is Ramia. Any gaps you find between the findings of the report and some of the conventional wisdom that circulates? How does the report, in any of the aspects you wish to address, provides an adjustment or a correction, or sheds light on things that we thought we knew?
I think Rabia covered the main ideas or the main things in about the story of Syrians. But let me say that the report was more scientific, give a scientific evidence, or based on the scientific evidence, rather than more a normal or usual narratives about the Syrian conflict. So what we try to say that this is the injustice. Let's be realistic about how Syrians suffers and what kind of difficulties that they face from now to build their new future. But in the other side, we are looking at the society as a really a main player. Even people look at the main actors like the government or the regime or the non-state actors as a main player in the Syrian conflict. But we look at the society as the main player, and the ability of the society to really build and reconstruct Syria and the future of Syria. And we put alternatives which is visible. We can do it. It's like not like, you know, like statements or wisdoms as what you said. It's really something we can follow, and especially that we make this report in participatory way. So we discuss with people, we participate, the civil society, different partners from different kinds of political backgrounds. We discuss with them about everything. So it is a kind of a Syrian report, not a SCPR report. So that's what we pretend. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ramia. Omar, any last words? يعني last هلا مش absolutely.
Last words ever. This actually may be my last words ever, but no, it's in addition to what Ramia and Rabia said. I think the asset or the contribution. I mean, when you say corrective, that's an interesting way to put it, because corrective depends on corrective to which narratives, and there's so many narratives on Syria, depending on what circles you're in or what aspects of the Syrian conflict you're involved with, that are partial. And I think part of what this report attempts to do is provide totality of the picture. And I think one aspect of that is applying the same standards and measures to all the actors rather than showing a political bias towards one actor or the other. So when we try to analyze the actions of all the actors, we analyze them consistently, or I'm saying the report and the SCPR's work, by applying the same standards, by applying the same methodology, through empirical evidence and investigation, through attempting to make a judgment on evidence based on what we know. And when we don't know something, it states that we don't know this aspect of the conflict, rather than attempting to basically say evidence that doesn't exist. So that's one aspect of it. I think this total picture rather than a partial picture. The other aspect of it is incorporating elements, for example, when thinking of the conflict economy, that are much broader and more comprehensive than what we usually, for example, define as a conflict economy, which looks at not just internal chains of accumulation happening within the country or trans-border transactions and smuggling, but also broader aspects, including the role of the external actors, including transnational militarization and selling of weapons and selling of basically facilitating militarization throughout the region by big powers. So it's an attempt to broaden our understanding of what conflict economy is beyond, for example, a partial view of it. It also looks at economic policies. So though we tend to focus on the political struggle, we look at the role of economic policies before and after the conflict, not just in Syria, but in the region, particularly neoliberal economic policies that have increased inequalities and exclusion. So I think that aspect of the report would be a useful corrective. And as I said, it's a rich report that's worth looking at if one wants a broader, more comprehensive understanding of the Syrian conflict.
Thank you, Omar, and thanks to everyone. I will proceed now to address some of these questions. I've collated some of them so that we could actually address the questions that you feel are pertinent to what you would like to address. So we have a few questions, and a couple of them fall in the same category. I will not address the last name of the person who asked the question. I will just say the first name. So we have a question that is somewhat similar from Tony and from Basilius. From Tony, I'm assuming it's a he, asks, I was wondering whether reconciliation, and of course, what type of reconciliation, is a category within the justice conception that you are presenting. So what is the role of reconciliation in this set of presentations and the report? And a question by Basilius that addresses in a way a similar dimension. He states that some scholars argue that sectarian identification, in quotation marks, in Syria has become a driver of social organization, even more than regional, local, or class-based formations, which in turn will affect the effort to rebuild the social fabric in the future. And he's asking to what extent your findings agree or disagree with these arguments. I'll stop here for this set of two questions, and I'll add one more question by Sausan, who is addressing the role of the international community in Syria's war economy, especially given the efforts of the international community to ensure conflict sensitivity and non-interference of the regime. Of course, everything is still taking place in a problematic way despite these efforts. So Sausan is asking, in your perspective, what can be done regarding the short or medium term in the short and medium term to enforce a rights-based conditionality on the engagement of the international community, one that reduces the contribution of the international community to the war economy or to empowering warlords, which is something that just came up in the discussion. So I'll ask these three sets of questions, and we'll also go chronologically, unless Rabia wants to pass and Omar wants to pass, then Ramia wants to pass, then Omar can answer, or we'll start with Rabia. I can repeat the questions if you like.
2 times, please.
So Tony.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we extend the idea of reconciliation to build social congruences. So it's not just about bringing people from 2 communities with one intermediaries to do like a local reconciliation, or to bring the subjugating actors to impose reconciliations on the people. We are going beyond that to say, from at least from the samples that we give for the strategies on development overlapping nodes, or in dismantling conflict economy and congruences and children, to say that you can have a package of improving the foundation of reconciliation on the long term. And this means an open public discussion. This means more congruences on specific priorities, not on all, on different stage, across regions, communities, sects, displaced, not displaced, refugees, non-refugees, etc. So we think that without building foundation, reconciliation will be like an act, like something not substantial. And that's our critique in the report for the transitional justice, that it go with the symptoms, not with the core roots of the injustice. And this is a major issue in many of the countries that adapt this kind of, which is very important, but it's not enough. The second point, I will say, for the sectarian issue, I think this is very important because it's part of our identity. However, the war aggravated. But I will give a very simple example about the counter argument against Basilius. That when it comes to the economic interest, you can see that a clash within a sect. When it comes to the control of power, it comes a clash among sects. We have hundreds of examples in Syria. The clash between Daesh and al-Nusra is one example. The clash between different factions that affiliated to the regime is another example. Within the Syrian army, between the opposition army. This is not sectarian driven social structure or building the political power. So the argument that it's based on the interest. So now the interest is to exclude Rami. So they exclude one of the family. So it's not just from the sects, from the family. So it's based on the controlling of power rather than sects. But of course, they are very successful in using it and making the people more attracted. Not just, I said, identity. So sometimes it's identity. For example, when you talk about Aleppo, you are talking about class. When you are talking about Deir ez-Zor, you are talking about Al-Ashair. So it's not consistent. They use the identity based on the situation. And the last question, this is from my point of view. I'll leave my colleagues to reflect on this. What Sausan mentioned, I think there is 2 points. The first one, that the structure and legitimacy of the UN is based on the influential actors who are give the fund and have the political power, and that's what we addressed in the report as global injustice and the Security Council. One example. The other example is how the UN performed. So it influenced to a large extent by the key actors, the key global actors. The second point, that they are talking about normatives. So they said, we are with SDGs, for example. And when you come to the implementation, they subordinate to the key actors who are controlling the ground, either in terms of the political influence of those actors or through the neoliberal policies. Neoliberal policies means that they want to reform the health sector using the neoliberal policies that increase inequalities and reduce the global coverage of health. So at the same time, you want health for all, and you use the policies that don't reach the point or the normative that you are mentioning. So they are adapting a system, which is the global system now, that are diverted from the normative, but they are mandated to the normative. This is not to simplify it, but this is at least I think the general picture.
Thank you. Ramya, you can address any or all of the three questions.
Just one question. I want to comment on the sectarian identity. What we mentioned in the report and what's important is how the identity, different identities used in the by all parties to destroy the social capital of the people and the fabric of the society. So it was used, the sectarian identity was used more than was part of the root of the conflict in Syria. So just this, how we mentioned this in the report and how we deal with the sectarian identities or the political, how they politize the identities, whether the Arab, Kurds, or ethnics, Islamic, Christians, Shia, Sunnah, all different kinds of identities was used. So that's it.
Did you want to address the international dimension, or you can pass?
Rabia covered. Thank you.
شكرا. Omar? Maybe we shouldn't start with Rabia because he's covering all the points. We will leave Rabia until the end.
No, I mean, I think I would just, I think it's a difficult question, and as Rabia and Ramia said, there are problematic ways in which cause and effect are mixed up in this analysis. So I think an underappreciated role is the way that armed violence makes choices for people, rather than people choosing violence in a way that violence chooses you or forces you to take sides or forces you to perhaps accept or resort to various narratives and identities. And in a way, a lot of these narratives were outcomes of the conflict, but they have become themselves causal factors in sustaining the conflict. So while it is true that we can not say these are deep causes or these are things that have animated the conflict, there are issues that perhaps might fuel it. And I think countering it is precisely through the kind of evidence that is presented in this report of looking at the institutional setups of the various actors, and have these different actors set up more just institutions that essentially lend credence that one actor is somehow owing to its identity more just than the other. And the answer is no, that there are various severe problems with the institutional, judicial, governance, economic outcomes in the various models approached. And I think the push towards equality based on citizenship, the push for solidarity, the push for justice are the ways to overcome these divisions that have become entrenched or somehow accepted as a result of the conflict.
Thank you so much, Omar. I am assuming that we are actually reaching the 90. I mean, we passed the 90-minute stage, but before we conclude, I would like to pose one last question that was sent that is principally about the question of urban-rural cleavages and how they have been affected by the reallocation of wealth in the country, especially given that the level of poverty, which is now more than 80 or 85%, has this cleavage been exacerbated by the conflict, and to what extent? And I'll ask each of you to address it if you would like to, starting with Ramya. ربيع حنخليك للآخر لأنه مش عم بتخلي لحدا شيء.
Okay, I pass from this question. I will leave it to Rabia.
تفضل يا ربيع. اعطيه جواب سيء.
Really, I don't have the exact answer about this question, so I will leave it to Rabia, because we didn't write so much about the urban rural area, but Rabia have more concentration about this.
تفضل يا ربيع.
Thank you, Ramya. The first point is, yes, there is a huge disparities between rural and urban. And there is a conflict narratives there. The urban accused rural areas that they are occupied the country as they control the military before the conflict. And this narrative that this is one part of grievances in the urban or in the main cities, mainly Damascus and Aleppo. And the other narrative that this rural is excluded and poor, excluded from power, excluded from good living conditions, and this increase the grievances in the rural areas. And this is one of the narratives that have been used. Some people use the two narratives at the same time. Now, I think, yes, there is a huge disparities across Syria. Before the conflict, we have the northeastern rural areas and even the cities is very marginalized comparing to the rest of Syria. And this is known and addressed in different policies, and there is no real mitigation for that. There is exaggeration of the impact of the last wave because of the drought. I mean, they exaggerate the number and they exaggerate the impact. But I think the rural problem is before. Now, the new liberal policies before the conflict increased the attraction of the people to leave the agriculture and go to the cities. And the cities is not ready, and there is no job opportunities in the modern economy. And so the fallacy of reform bring a lot of people to the cities without a solution. Now, during the conflict, simply the people left the cities because the regime want to control military the cities, which is more important than the rural areas. So the rural areas became a space for people to fight against the regime. And the problem that this means that there is a collapse because most of the destruction happened in the opposition-held areas and mainly rural areas. Of course, later on become the destruction of cities itself. What I want to say that during the conflict, there is a huge shift towards cities. And there is some cities, quote unquote, that became rural. Because if we have a definition of cities as 20,000 or 50,000 according to the law, so there is a lot of cities that lost the population and become, by definition, rural areas. By living conditions became rural areas in terms of the poor, sieged, without any kind of facilities. So the concentration of the cities is a huge challenge because most of the people will resist coming back to the rural areas. Most of the refugees will resist coming back to the country. So because the people adapt to the new life or new locations. So I think this is one part of the story. The other part, that the injustice between rural and urban is complicated in the conflict because there is cities that, I mean, just demolished, and there is rural areas that not touchable, that still has the ability to receive people. But in general, I think it's one of the pillar of the continuation of injustice between those two sides.
شكرا ربيع. عمر إذا خلي لك شيء. You want to pass? Okay. Let me see here. We are actually reaching. We've reached and surpassed what we had promised, which is a 90-minute discussion. If you would like to further engage with this report and with our panelists and this project altogether, please find your way to the website, the SCPR website. And we promise that on the website, as well as on Jadaliyya and on Tadween Publishing, there will be notices about further developments, especially regarding the final release of the final copy of the volume, which will be open access and electronically delivered at no charge. And there will also be a hard copy that could be purchased for the price or the cost of the production only. That will happen, I understand from Rabia, that will happen relatively soon on the end of SCPR, and we at Tadween will proceed to make this available in short order. I would really like to thank our participants, not just for this presentation, but also for the immeasurable work that has been put into this project and the labor of so many people that Rabir addressed earlier on that cannot be counted, which represents the invisible soldiers, the invisible work that we do not see, but is the foundation of so much of the data that allowed us and our authors to present and finalize the report. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. I appreciate that we also had two forums. We had the Zoom call and Facebook, and people have been joining on both fora. And before we conclude and end this webinar, I'd like to ask if any of our guest participants would like to say a final word.
No, thank you everyone for sticking to the very end. I know this is like a very difficult medium, so I appreciate everyone who came and who stayed with us, and even those who didn't stay with us. So thank you all.
Yeah, same. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Our happy moment to launch this report and this effort after 3 years or more of working. Thank you so much.
We are looking forward for your comments and suggestions and future dialogue, hopefully, for further development of this kind of research. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Bassam.
Islam. All right, with this we conclude, and we hope to see you on the pages of SCPR's website as well as Jadaliyya, where we are relaunching an effort at the Syria page to address Syria matters and very much also focused on the findings of this report. Stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you all soon. Shukran. Salam. Salam.
Thank you all.
Rabia Banna. I must
Thank you.
على فكرة صورتك أنت أحلى من اللوجو. عمر ما صدق خلصنا.
ما معقول. لسه بدنا نشكرك بس ما معقول راح فورا.
يلا سلام.
سلامات.